The diner on the Crossroads. I wish I could go back and change that fateful night when my world was shattered by the supernatural. Perhaps if I had taken the highway instead of that desolate back road, things would be different. But I can't undo what was set into motion by forces beyond my comprehension. It started out as a typical Friday evening. After wrapping up work at the office, I hit the road for a weekend camping trip. Just me, my truck, and the gear packed up in the back. The drive was long, but peaceful, taking me through endless miles of thick forest and winding mountain roads. As night fell, I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, ending up on an isolated route I didn't recognize. No big deal. I had a decent map and figured I'd just reroute at the next town and find my way to the campground. Except there was no next town for what felt like an eternity. My truck's headlights bored through the inky darkness, revealing only a ribbon of cracked asphalt slicing through an endless sea of trees. No buildings, no signs, not even a pull-off or intersection to turn around. Just that lonesome two-lane road, the looming tree line, and an oppressive silence broken only by the rumble of my engine. After what felt like hours of driving with no turn or milestone in sight, I finally crested a hill and saw a solitary light flickering in the distance. As I approached, the light resolved into a rusty old neon sign, Cora's Diner, it promised, in fading red letters. Relieved to have found at least some sign of civilization, I pulled into the gravel parking lot, alongside a few other ancient vehicles. The diner itself was a ramshackle wood-frame building that had seen far better days. It sat alone at a crossroads in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by blackness in every direction. The parking lot was almost deserted, with just an ancient Ford pickup and a beat-up compact taking up 2 of the spaces. Everywhere else, scraggly weeds poked up through the cracks in the crumbling asphalt. I grabbed my phone, double-checking for a signal or GPS lock, but there was nothing. No bars, no location services available. Another dead zone in these endless woods, just my luck. With no other options, I pocketed the phone and headed inside, pushing through the diner's rickety door. A bell jangled overhead as I stepped across the threshold and was instantly transported decades into the past. The interior looked frozen in the 1960s, from the battered Formica counters to the elderly jukebox crammed into one corner. Everything was bathed in the greasy yellow glow of flickering fluorescent lights, and faint wafts of cigarette smoke seemed to cling to the air, despite no one appearing to be smoking inside. There were just 2 other customers, seated at the far end of the counter, a wiry older man in grease-stained coveralls hunched over a coffee mug, and a younger man picking listlessly at a plate of fries. Behind the counter, a stout woman with a ragged perm stepped through a cloudy haze of smoke, a pencil stuck behind her ear. "Just you tonight, sugar?" she asked in a dry Texas twang as I slid onto one of the stools. Her name tag identified her as Cora, matching the diner's sign out front. "Yeah, just me," I replied, got myself turned around, out on the road. "You wouldn't happen to have a working payphone or Wi-Fi I could use?" Cora snorted, a harsh laugh that rattled in her chest. "Honey, this is about as modern as we get out here. Best you just sit and wait for that dang cell signal to pick back up again." With no other choice, I thanked her and ordered a coffee and a slice of pecan pie. At least I could refuel while I figured out my next move. Cora scribbled down the order and wandered off to the kitchen, leaving me alone with the other 2 customers. I stared around at the diner's retro decor and faded landscape photos covering the walls. Aside from the quiet hiss of the grill in back and a staticky whisper from the vintage radio behind the counter, the place was silent as a tomb. That silence was shattered a moment later as the bell over the door clanged again. I turned to see who else was joining our cozy gathering and felt the blood drain from my face in sheer terror. Framed in the doorway was a monstrosity that could only be described as half-human. It was vaguely bipedal in shape, but its arms were far too long, the fingers tipped with jagged black talons. Its torso was a gnarled, hairless trunk, lined with putrid sores that oozed a foul-smelling pus. Most horrifying of all was its head, a human skull frozen in a permanent scream, the empty sockets glowing with twin points of sickly green fire. For an endless heartbeat, I sat there, paralyzed in shock and revulsion, mind stuttering to process what I was seeing. Then the thing's lipless mouth cracked open, and it released a gurgling rattle that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. The other two customers continued eating, seemingly oblivious to the 7-foot-tall abomination as it shuffled inside on legs bent the wrong way. The door swung shut behind it with a hollow thud that shook me from my stupor. I leapt up, sending my stool clattering to the floor. The creature jerked in my direction, the green fire glaring straight through me. What the hell is that thing? I choked out in a hoarse shout. The younger man glanced over in passionless disinterest before returning to his plate as if nothing was amiss. Cora stepped from the kitchen, tray in hand, and clucked her tongue. Now don't be rude, Han. That's just Earl. He's been coming round these parts for longer than I can rightly recall. You don't mean no harm. My mouth worked soundlessly at the utter absurdity of her words. The thing, Earl, slid onto a stool at the opposite end of the counter, folding its long appendages awkwardly atop the formica. You can't be serious, I stammered at the unassuming Cora. What is that abomination doing in here? How is it even possible? She flashed me an impatient look as she slid my coffee and pie in front of me. In one deft motion, she produced a menu from under the counter and slapped it down in front of the monstrosity. It raised a alone hand and trailed a finger down the laminated page, scanning the items with its soulless pits. I'll take your judgments up front if you can't abide it here, Cora shot back. Ain't my fault. Folks like you can't see what's plain as day in front of you. Earl's been a good customer for decade upon decade. As she spoke, the thing rattled out a series of gurgling croaks. She nodded as if it made perfect sense, then hollered over her shoulder. Hey, Mel? Earl wants a patty melt with extra natcha and a piece of lemon meringue. I snapped a look at the kitchen door and froze. There, staring back at me through the haze, was another creature like Earl. This one stood on two sinewy legs connecting to a torso that seemed contorted and twisted all wrong, arms almost scraping the floor, torso tapering to a point, ending in a reptilian tail. Its skull-like face was vaguely lizard-like, with rows of fangs and a jaw that seemed to stretch wider than physically possible. I screamed and leapt back from the counter, my heart jackhammering in my chest. Outside, the wind howled and tree branches lashed against the diner's windows, shadows flickering against the glass. A storm seemed to be blowing in through the black night. Mel, get out here and calm this feller down before he disturbs the other guests, Cora scolded, exasperated. The monstrous reptilian cook slid out of the kitchen on legs that bent in the wrong places, talons clattering on the tile floor. It towered over me, fanged maw opening wide as if to swallow me whole. There ain't nothing to fear, the cook rumbled in a grating baritone. We're just folks, same as you, trying to get by, like anybody else. Before it could move closer, I turned and bolted for the exit, barreling through the door, into the parking lot as thunder crashed overhead. Cold rain instantly lashed at my face, driven by a howling wind that seemed to grasp with icy claws. I sprinted for my truck, hands numb and shaking so badly I could barely grip the door handle. Wrenching it open, I scrambled inside and slammed it shut, chest heaving as I sat plastered to the seat. Heart pounding, I quickly smashed the lock and scrambled for the ignition. As I twisted the key, the engine made a choked whirring sound, but didn't catch. I tried again with the same result. No. This couldn't be happening. Not here, of all places. Frantically pumping the gas, I cranked the ignition a third time, to no avail. Panic creeping in to consume rational thought, I blinked hard against the panic and forced myself to think. Okay, first things first. Get some distance from that hellish diner. I could boost off the old truck, parked in the other space, and drive until I found a town with a mechanic. I slid from the cab, pulling my jacket tight against the driving rain and wind. As I turned towards the pickup, a bright flash of lightning arced across the sky overhead, followed an instant later by bone-rattling thunder. By its stark light, I saw a shape detach itself from the shadows between the buildings and lumber towards me on twisted limbs. It was the Earl thing, trailing ropes of putrid slime that steamed in the downpour. A taloned hand scraped against the side of my truck as it moved closer, leaving deep gouges in the paint. Before I could flee, another bellow of thunder drowned out all sound. Strobing flashes of lightning etched the scene in stark relief, each burst revealing new arrivals lurching from the tree line. Gnarled forms in every horrific configuration, slithering and stalking impossibly across the gravel, slack-jawed skulls that seemed to drink in the feeble light with empty sockets, torsos pulsing with organs visible beneath translucent skin. Appendages tipped with hooked talons, and compound eyes glaring in 1,000 directions at once. I stood there, petrified, frozen to the core by escalating dread, as more and more of these threats closed in beneath the lashing skies. The world broke apart in hellish fractured images with each strobe of lightning, searing their monstrous forms onto my mind's eye in rapid succession. 1 second, a cluster of spindly shapes wrenching themselves free of the tree line, the next a wisp of pale vapor rising from a gaping maw lined with fangs. Claws clutching as nightmare silhouettes reared on cloven hooves, only to dissolve back into the Stygian darkness. Discordant shadows flickered again and again, amidst an impenetrable vortex of vile slithering shapes with each flash. No matter where I turned, more abominations peeled away from the night, twos inexorably nearer, a surging tide of terror sounding its endless gurgle and rattle. And then, just as suddenly as the onslaught had begun, the flashes and rumbles ceased just as abruptly. I was left standing in the eerie eye of nature's fury, rain still sheeting down, but with an oppressive silence bearing far greater dread. One final crack of lightning forked across the sky, with a deafening boom, freezing my breath in my lungs. When the afterimage faded from my vision, leaving me blinking in the gloom once more, they were there. Surrounding me entirely, packed shoulder to misshaped shoulder, was an endless sea of twisted forms, leering with vacant hunger from depths of eternal night. Silhouettes loomed mere inches away, spines undulated through mists of drifting fog, 1,000 unblinking eyes pierced the veil just beyond my line of sight. Close enough for the reek of decay and rot to overpower my senses, their gurgling breaths hot and damp against my rain-soaked face. Too close, far too close, all exits cut off by the swarming horde, with no path of escape remaining. With another bone-rattling peal of thunder, the full brunt of the storm bore down once more, lashing rain and howling winds whipping in frenzied clouds of fog and debris. My vision was swallowed entirely, subsumed in an endless deluge of swirling blackness and shadow. All I can perceive now is the cacophony of 1,000 guttural rattles closing in tighter from every side, surrounding me in an endless sea of eternal night. Past, future, and even the present itself have melted away, leaving no anchor to reality save the cold certainty that oblivion itself has come calling for me on this lonesome road. Though I thrash and scream until my throat is raw, the nebulous tide swallows my feeble efforts utterly. The last spark of hope flickers and fades as I'm dragged down into that soundless, sightless void, alone with so many ravening silhouettes that my terror becomes an exquisite agony as eternal as the shrouded shapes themselves.